Thank you, Jamie. I am honored to be here. My thanks to Professor Atherton Lowry, Bishop Timothy Sr., Rector, Father Joseph Shanaski, Vice Rector. There is a 4-page handout with this talk. The main title of my talk names a man, Hans Jonas, and names my central philosophical topic, the test of self-reference. The test of self-reference is one of the most basic tools in our philosophical toolbox. It is not unique to Hans Jonas. In fact, we find a version of the test in Aristotle's Metaphysics, Book 4, Chapter 4, on the fellow who denies the principle of non-contradiction and therewith denies the meaning of words, but continues to listen to argument. I have picked Hans Jonas because his use of the test of self-reference to test strong, science-based claims about human mind and will is exemplary. Before presenting the test of self-reference by means of this shining example, let me say a word about Hans Jonas, 1903 to 1993. Jonas was a student of Heidegger. He was, accordingly, indelibly impressed by the power of Heidegger's thought and was indelibly affected by what happened after 1933. His mother died at Auschwitz. Jonas's work centered on overcoming the nihilism that he correctly detected in Heidegger's philosophy. Jonas's response to Heidegger took the form of an account of organic life, its evolution and culmination in the emergence of the human. For Jonas, life grounds a realm of value, of something good in itself that extends up to an ethics of responsibility for human beings. Jonas's thought spans Heidegger, history of philosophy and religion, and modern natural science. The short writing from which I take the shining example of the test of self-reference is an appendix to his book, The Imperative of Responsibility. The appendix, handout page 1, is titled Impotence or Power of Subjectivity, a reappraisal of the psychophysical problem. Take subjectivity here to mean consciousness or all that is implied when we use the first-person pronoun, I. Now, if anything seems plain and obvious, it is that I have within me the power of choice to do certain things or not to do them. I choose to raise my arm, a part of my body, or not to raise it, or to move my fingers, parts of my body, at the keyboard to write certain words and sentences, like the ones I am reading to you now, and not others. But does not our powerful science of nature challenge this plain experience? Doesn't physics, the premier science of the motion of bodies, even refute the possibility of mental or psychic causes of motion in our bodies? This is the psychophysical problem first arising in the 17th century in the notorious metaphysical dualism of René Descartes. Body is mindless, geometrical extension. Mind is unextended thought. They have nothing in common, mind and body. How can they interact? But Descartes is not the founder of our tradition of physics. Newton is. In the preface to the Principia, inspired by his theory of the solar system, Newton proposed, it's a research program, that we conceive any body as a solar system writ small. That is, take any body as a cloud of tiny particles, all moving on trajectories in space, trajectories that are determined. That's the thing. Trajectories of bodies determined, bodies whether big or small, by the masses of the particles and the distances between them, and by forces of attraction and repulsion that have nothing to do with mind or consciousness, thought or choice. Indeed, the physical quantities, mass, charge, position, velocity, momentum, the associated gravitational and later electrical forces share nothing with mind. Laplace then famously proclaimed as dogma, not a research program, dogma, the Newtonian universal forces and particles model. This doctrine came to be known as Newtonian Laplacian determinism. From classical physics, we can stride down the subsequent history of the natural sciences through electricity and magnetism, thermodynamics and statistical mechanics, chemistry, biology, molecular biology, to neuroscience today. Through these many stages in the development of natural science, the psychophysical problem persists. One way or another, the causes of motion, exclusively sufficient causes of motion, in all bodies, share nothing with mind. So, does consciousness, subjectivity, have the power to move our bodies, or, in shocking contradiction to the plainest experience, is consciousness, our minds and wills, impotent over bodies? Hence the title of Jonas's appendix. Needless to say, we live in a world in which our belief in science impinges on, strongly impacts the way we understand ourselves. In this situation of strong belief in science and uncertainty about its human implications, the test of self-reference is especially useful. So let us look at what Jonas has written. Handout, page 1. Historical prologue, says Jonas. I begin with an episode from the history of science. In 1845, 3 young, enthusiastic physiologists, pupils of the great Johannes Müller in Berlin, made a formal pact to fight the view, hitherto regnant and called vitalism, that life involves forces other than those found in the interaction of inorganic bodies. In other words, vitalism taught that, for example, in digestion, the chemical processes in our stomachs followed laws different from those of acidic dissolution of foodstuff in laboratory test tubes. Vitalism is false. Chemistry is universal, not different for living versus non-living matter. But in their enthusiasm, these 3 young men went too far, eliminating by their doctrine not only vitalism, but mind and will as efficacious in human conduct. Who were these 3? Jonas continues. They were Emil Dubois-Reymond, Ernst Brücke, and Hermann von Helmholtz, all to become very famous. Dubois-Reymond and Brücke between them even pledged with a solemn oath that they would establish and compel acceptance of this truth. No other forces than the common physical-chemical ones are active within the organism. All 3 kept their vow throughout their lives with spectacular scientific success, which in turn helped to make their position an article of faith and vitalism a discredited cause throughout the life sciences. What escaped them was the fact that by making a pledge, no matter which, they already contradicted or acted counter to the particular content of this pledge, for they did not bind themselves to what is not a matter for decision at all, namely, to let the molecules of their brains, now and hereafter, take their causally prescribed courses and allow them to determine their thought and speech, if they do that anyway. But rather, they bound themselves to remain faithful in the future to a present insight, thus by implication declaring at least their subjectivity to be master over their conduct. In the mere fact of a vow, they credited something totally non-physical, their relation to truth, with just that power over their overt behavior which the content of their vow on principle denied. I'll stop here and comment at the little parallel vertical lines. Here is our first example of the test of self-reference. The test consists in referring the statement under examination to itself, hence the name self-reference. More precisely, refer the content of the statement right back. There's an intimacy to this that one often fails to notice. Refer the content of the statement, bend it right back to the speaker's act of making the statement. This is sometimes called the argument of retortion, tort law, torture, bending. So the test of self-reference is also known as the argument from retortion. Refer the content of the statement right back to the speaker's act of making the statement. Are these two, content stated and speech act of stating it, consistent? Or is there a certain type of contradiction, one that is called a performative as opposed to logical self-contradiction? Failures of the test of self-reference typically consist in falling into a performative self-contradiction. In the case before us, look at the content of their claim. All animal and human behavior is fully determined by physicochemical processes, to put it crassly, determined by jiggling molecules in the brain. If that is true, then vows are impossible, since we'll just do and say, we'll just do and make utterances at our mouths, whatever our molecules, which have no relation to truth, determine. Hence, Jonas, again, quote, in the mere fact of a vow, that is their speech act, they credited by that speech act something totally non-physical, their relation to truth, with just that power over their overt behavior which the content of their vow on principle denied, end quote. The outcome of this test of self-reference on those three enthusiastic young students is failure. This failure means not that vitalism is true. It was falsified by William Beaumont in the United States in the late 1820s by comparing digestion in the living stomach with acid reactions in test tubes. Rather, this failure means that our distinctively human desire for knowledge and orientation to truth is, or can be, a genuine cause of motion in our bodies, somehow. How exactly our minds or souls can work through the material in our brains to produce speech that strives to be truthful and sometimes is an open question. Perhaps we should not say that our souls work through our brain matter, like an artisan working on material, but that, following Aristotle, our souls or minds inform our bodies and our brains, giving rise, somehow, to our truth-seeking and truth-telling operation. At any rate, this is called the hard problem of consciousness today. The three young students in 1845 should have restricted the range of their claim for science from being comprehensive, thus including themselves and their own claim, to being partial. Physics and chemistry can indeed account fully and sufficiently for a part of our behavior, but not the whole of it. Let us follow Jonas as he continues to the next and most striking example of the test of self-reference, namely, testing the claim that mind is epiphenomenon. Handout on the left after the little parallel lines. Quote, making a promise with faith in the ability to keep it and the equally implied alternative of not keeping it does admit into the chart of reality, if not into scientific discourse, a force, quote, other than those found in the interaction of inorganic bodies, end quote. Fidelity would be such a force, as would every other rule of mind over behavior, that is, over body. I shall first try to articulate the hoary psychophysical problem, then discuss the epiphenomenon formula with which it has been bent one-sidedly to the purported demands of natural science or materialism. Statement of the psychophysical problem: truth or fraud of consciousness. Subjectivity, self-awareness, our consciousness, exists. It either is what it claims to be, or it enacts a stage play behind which another type of happening hides. In the first case, it's testimony. For example, that I raise my arm because I will it for the sake of teaching and learning. That experience is credible at face value. In the second case, the science-based claim, it is deceptive, a mere disguise or window dressing of neurophysiological processes which parade in the fancy dress of will but lift the arm without will or the cooperation of will. That is, they do so irrespective of the presence of a willing sensation. The standpoint which grants the psyche its effectiveness, that's ordinary experience, stays in agreement with its self-testimony and needs no further reasons. The standpoint, science-based, which denies its claims must have special reasons for doing so. These reasons, whatever their strength, cannot silence the disputed testimony itself, and thus the natural standpoint, constantly nourished by the subjective evidence, is never abolished in fact. But deprived of the privilege of naivete, once the question of credibility is raised, the natural standpoint, I raise my hand by free choice for the sake of teaching and learning. Once the question of credibility is raised, the natural standpoint must defend itself against those reasons, since at the serious suspicion of an illusion, even its irresistibility ceases to count in its favor. On the other hand, the suspicion must indeed be serious. Thus, one must first examine the reasons which here contest the validity of immediate, plain experience, and put naivete in the role of a theater goer who takes the play on the stage for reality. Clearly, only the strongest reasons count when it is a question of condemning all mental life to the status of illusion. I can see two such reasons and confine myself to them, ignoring all weaker ones. They are, 1, that any action of mind on matter is incompatible with the immanent completeness of physical determination. That one is technical. I won't be talking about it tonight. Second reason, 2, that the mental as such is also incapable of intervention, being nothing but a unilaterally dependent concomitant of physical events and lacking any force of its own. This, too, I call the epiphenomenon argument, end quote. I focus on the second of these, the epiphenomenon argument. To introduce it, I use the metaphor of foam on waves. The metaphor is helpful, but slightly imperfect because of Newton's third law. My metaphor of foam on waves is this. Mind is to matter, the brain, as the foam on waves. Think of the seaside waves are coming in. There's foam on the crests. Mind is to matter as the foam on waves is to the waves, a side effect, generated by and dependent on the motion of the water, but in no way a cause of motion of the waves. Jonas's presentation of this argument, his analysis of it, and his reply to it form the core of my talk today. Handout, page 2, the argument for epiphenomenalism, the primacy of matter. There is matter without mind, but not mind without matter. The first is demonstrated by all lifeless nature, plus a good part of living nature. The second by the fact that all mind, here the blanket title for subjectivity of every kind and degree, appears only in conjunction with certain organizations of matter, organisms, nerves, brains, and that no example of bodiless mind is known. This observation suggests that matter has independent and primary being, mind only secondary being, derivative from it. Before pursuing this line of thought, let us take a closer look at the concept of epiphenomenon as such. It says in general that the subjective, or the psychical, or the mental, is the concomitant of certain physical occurrences in brains. The concomitance is one-sided, not reciprocal. The physical processes, as the primary reality, are autonomous. Their secondary psychical expression is totally heteronymous, or a mere product of an other. The epiphenomenon status of mind then compels the conclusion that in the case, for example, of raising my arm, only the objective neuromuscular explanation or description is correct, while the subjective one, in terms of my will and intention, is a non-authentic symbolic transcription for it. Neurology, communication theory, and cybernetics are at work to implement this materialist postulate, still largely empty, nota bene with regard to the higher functions of consciousness. Implement this postulate by concrete mechanistic explanations or model constructions for increasingly complex cerebral processes. The initial successes justify the expectation. So the protagonists say that no barrier of principle, nothing in the nature of things, will stop progress on this road. The redundancy of subjective purpose. Among the subjective phenomena, there are the so-called ends or purposes. For them, too, it must hold that their subjective presence has no possible influence on the course of things. Rather, as already their presence only mirrors an objective state of the substratum, so also the putative acting because of them ensues in truth from the same material conditions, of which this appearance itself had been a symbol. The counter-witness of subjectivity on this point is not to be accepted. Socrates, therefore, was not right when, in the famous discourse of his last night, Phaedo 99, following lines, he rejected the corporeal explanation of sitting there and awaiting the hemlock and proclaimed the explanation in terms of mind, his ideas of right and duty as the only true one. Socrates was wrong. The appearing of consciousness adds something to the composition of reality by which it becomes different, reality, descriptively but not dynamically. It, the appearing of consciousness, is, but nothing follows from it for the rest of things. Nothing propagates from it into their further course. The rest of reality remains what it would also be without this mirage in its midst. That which is endowed with consciousness does not behave as it does because it is conscious, but is conscious because it behaves as it does, that is, as its physical makeup makes it behave. The metaphysical riddle. Existence of a delusion in itself. The no consequence rule applies to the mental in two directions. Outward toward the physical sphere, as just explained. It's not my conscious intention that enables me and leads me and is the best cause of my raising my hand. It's those jiggling molecules in my brain, as just explained. But there's another direction in which the no consequence rule applies. And this is what makes Jonas's use of the test of self-reference so exemplary. The mind is also impotent inwardly toward its own continuation. That is, the impotence must, besides that of determining the body in action, also include that of self-determination of thinking and thought. This is just what the concept of epiphenomenon provides for, by denoting something which each moment originates anew from the basis and whose continuation, therefore, is not its own but that of the basis, as in a motion picture. Now, this is Jonas's metaphor of the movie projector. It's better than my metaphor of water on waves. As in a motion picture, the next phase of a movement seen on the screen does not originate from the preceding phase, as it appears to do so, but independent of it from the projector that emits both the preceding and the present frame. And thus on the screen, contrary to appearance, in truth, nothing moves. So also the temporal successor of a now, the standing, flowing now of consciousness, cannot come from this, present now, not from the preceding now, but like itself must come from the physical substratum of which each state of consciousness is by definition the epiphenomenon. Thus it, the apparent flow of time, mirrors the progress of the substratum while appearing as progress of itself. As in the movie, this appearance is mere illusion. The hammer shown to crash down on the anvil is an image sequence, not a dynamic action. The deliberation terminating in a resolution, like the resolution made by the 3 enthusiastic students of physiology. The deliberation terminating in a resolution is just a sign sequence, not a real bringing about. The way goes not from sign to sign, but from brain state to brain state, and only hence each time to its equivalent in the sign script. To stay with the movie comparison, it is the continued projection that generates the continuation of the projected image. This, the projected image, itself is powerless. No thought engenders further thought. No state of mind is pregnant with the next. But since precisely this, no state of mind pregnant with the next, this is intrinsically claimed by them, it follows that all thinking is deception already in itself. And then once more, when it believes to pass outside itself into bodily action. The delusion of self-determination overarches the delusion of body determination. Both delusions are essential to the psyche. Soul is that very delusion, or make-believe, with which reality constantly deceives itself. The existence of such a delusion in itself is the absolute metaphysical riddle, which the epiphenomenon theorem braves in deference to physics, or to what is imagined to be the implications of physics. Imagination is a big problem, always. Claims made on behalf of science are often really made based on what the speaker imagines the implications of some piece of science to be. Jonas continues, "He who makes nature absurd in order to circumvent one of her riddles has passed sentence on himself and not on her, and has forfeited the right to speak any more of laws of nature." Jonas is being judgmental. That's a fate worse than a fate worse than death. Now for the culmination of my presentation of Jonas on the test of self-reference. Handout page 3. A theory-destroying theory. Even more directly than via the slander of nature has he passed judgment on himself by what his thesis says about the possible validity of any thesis whatsoever, and therefore about the validity claim of his own thesis. Every theory, be it the most mistaken, is a tribute to the power of thought, to which in the very meaning of the theorizing act it is allowed that it, thought, can rise above the power of extramental determinations, that it can judge freely on what is given in the field of representations, of evidence, that it is, first of all, capable of the resolve for truth. That is, the resolve to follow the guidance of insight and not the drift of fancies. But epiphenomenalism contends, that is, claims, the impotence of thinking and therewith its own inability to be independent theory. Indeed, even the extreme materialist must exempt himself qua thinker so that extreme materialism as a doctrine can be possible. But while even the Cretan, who declares all Cretans to be liars, can and must add, "except myself at this moment," the epiphenomenalist, who has defined the very nature of thought, cannot make this addition, because he too is swallowed up in the abyss of his universal verdict. Thus we have a twofold reductio ad absurdum, according to the twofold question of what to think of a reality that brings forth this futile image, and what of the attempt of this self-confessed mirage to establish a truth about that reality. Nature as an impostor on the one hand, a theory destroying itself on the other, was the outcome of the scrutiny. End quote. A striking performative self-contradiction thus results from this most exemplary use of the test of self-reference. We have a theory of the mind-brain relation, which theory, like all theories, is a product of the mind in its engagement with the world. In proposing a theory for us to accept as possibly true, we, the audience, must be able to assume that the theorizer the one who has come before us to claim our time, we must be able to assume that the theorizer was able to reason validly, step by step, from true or plausible premises. But the content of this theory of the mind-brain relation, the movie projector model, denies that reason can be responsible for its own movement of thought, denies that the human mind can determine itself to truth at all. As Jonas thus aptly concludes, epiphenomenalism is a theory that destroys the human activity of theorizing, thus destroys itself. Let us survey the terrain we have crossed. In our contemporary culture of strong belief in our powerful natural science, of uncertainty about its range and limitations, and confusion about its human implications, the test of self-reference can function as a gatekeeper. It can weed out excessive claims, claims that this or that particular body of science, or perhaps just an equation, claims that this or that particular body of science is universal or comprehensive. To say that a particular scientific theory is comprehensive means that it covers or comprehends the whole of reality. It's a theory of everything, including the speaker, whose credibility as a bona fide truth seeker then gets undermined. To pass the test of self-reference, it's simple. We just have to grant that the desire for knowledge, care for the truth, for the scientific truth, is a cause of motion in human bodies. Motion of tongue, lips, vocal cords, fingers at the keyboard. How exactly this happens is an open and profound question, but that it happens must be granted if we are to perform self-consistently as truth seekers and responsibly as potential truth tellers. This completes my presentation of Hans Jonas's exemplary use of the test of self-reference. Two more examples of knowledge claims to which we can apply the test of self-reference are given on the handout, page 3. Quote, "The only thing that's happening in nature is that organisms are striving for personal reproductive success." The late Stephen Jay Gould. Second, "The astonishing hypothesis is that you, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will, subjectivity, are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules," end quote. Francis Crick, The Astonishing Hypothesis. The first of these, by the late Stephen Jay Gould, claims that the Darwinian principles of natural selection and random variation are exclusively comprehensive over the realm of organisms. Well, refer the statement to itself. Specifically, was Stephen Jay Gould an organism? Yes. When he uttered those words, "The only thing happening is that organisms are striving for personal reproductive success," when he uttered those words to students at Harvard, was he striving only to mate with the female students? No. He was striving to share some truth about the remarkable science of paleontology. That's old fossils. To save the credibility of his claim, he needs to grant that there is at least one organism that is striving for more than reproductive success, namely himself, then the students in the room, and then possibly other human organisms. Let human mind-brain be a Darwinian survival tool, just not exclusively such. The second statement by Francis Crick, co-discoverer of DNA, is a materialist and reductionist claim that in fact falls under Jonas's critique. But just looking at that first sentence of the astonishing hypothesis, we cannot resist the temptation to ask, who is addressing us? The content of the sentence says that it is not a who. Not you, Dr. Crick. That, Dr. Crick, now in quotation marks, is some sort of an illusory superstructure on what is, quote, no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules, end quote. As my colleague Michael Gorman aptly notes, and he, Crick, wants us to buy his book. We may decide to buy Crick's book for the partial scientific truth that it must contain, but its author suffers from a lack of self-knowledge that disables him, makes him unable to judge the place of human being in the whole. He is not even aware of himself as the author responsible for the claims he is making based on the science he has researched. This, the scientist's self-forgetting, it's a mental habitus. Aristotle's ethics is probably the best ethics. The scientist's self-forgetting is a mental habitus, thus hard to change. It is the result of 3 centuries of natural science, the warranted content of which makes no mention of the human scientist. Science is supposed to be objective after all. Since the presence and activity of the scientist is not a principle or tenet or axiom essential to the content of the scientist can ignore himself. Specifically, the scientist can consider himself as a detached observer, effectively a pointer reading or digital display that registers the results of the experimental measurements, which measurements are to be matched to theoretical predictions in order to certify that the theory in question represents objective reality. This was the case for 3 centuries of natural science prior to the advent of quantum physics. In some way, quantum physics modifies the paradigm of the detached observer and implicates him more actively in the phenomena observed. In what way remains a disputed question. But this consideration, the presence and activity of the scientist as constitutive principle of the science, prepares my turn to the subtitle of this talk, on science and human freedom. The topic of science and human freedom is vast, and I offer here only the briefest and incomplete thoughts on human freedom and the natural sciences. Human freedom. The word freedom has acquired many meanings. Few notions are as susceptible to modification, theoretical innovation, and radicalization as freedom. Implicit in my preceding account of Hans Jonas is the old, non-radical meaning of freedom as intellectual or cognitive, namely our ability to think, to reason, select evidence, discuss with others, reflect, judge, for the sake of understanding some truth. On this account, truth is an end, telos, constitutive of our rational nature, in light of which end we can choose how best to proceed to discover and share the truth. Just as in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Book 3, Chapter 3, we voluntarily choose means appropriate to given ends. Truth, scientific truth about nature, being the end here in view. Natural science. Cognitive freedom, freedom of thought, merges with practice, making and doing, on a very high level in the scientific experiment. The scientific experiment mixes theory and practice, obviously. The famous quantum physicist John Bell once said that hearing about the experiments on quantum non-locality was for him, quote, a spiritual experience. Non-locality refers to a most remarkable phenomenon, the correlations between the results of 2 experimental measurements on a pair of specially prepared and spatially separated particles. They're not in the same place. They're further and further and further apart, hence the name no locus, non-locality. The 2 measurements, typically of the polarizations of a pair of photons originating from a single calcium atom, are performed far enough apart in space and close enough together in time that no light signal could get from one detection event to the other. This condition rules out any sort of hidden signaling between the pair of particles, since no signals can be transmitted faster than the speed of light, Einstein's special relativity. An essential part of these experiments is to switch arbitrarily the settings of the two detectors, typically the angles of the polarization detectors on which the two photons are incident. That's handout, page 4, bottom half of the page. There's a schematic diagram that's helpful showing the single source, the pair of particles emitted in opposite directions, and the detection events at A and B. Unfortunately, there's a serious defect of that diagram. Again, an essential part of these experiments is to switch arbitrarily the settings of the two defectors after emission of the pair and before detections occur in order to defeat any hidden past collusion between the two particles. Maybe somehow in their common source they had a game plan, like quarterback giving play to team whose motions are then correlated because of that past cause common to all the players. Could that be going on in some amazing way inside the source atom? That would be a past common cause that could explain these strange correlations. So without these free choices by the experimenters of the detector settings, theta 1 or theta 2 at position A on the left, psi 1 or psi 2 at site B on the right, and sites A and B recently have been 2 islands in the Canary Islands separated by 140 kilometers. Without these free choices that's the thing, free choice by the experimenter. Without these free choices by the experimenters of the detector settings, we would not have a good corroboration of the effect because the past common cause loophole would be open. I conclude that the validity of quantum physics, in fundamental contrast to classical physics, requires human conscious choice of the arrangement of apparatus as a necessary axiom. Of course, we must then try to understand how the experimenter's brain processes correspond to their mindful choices in view of the end, scientific truth, which they erotically desire. That's why do scientists do science? It's not for power and money. Of course, we must then try to understand how the experimenter's brain processes correspond to their mindful choices of what and how to measure. We are back to the unsolved hard problem of consciousness. But we have, I respectfully suggest, established that deterministic theories of human brain and behavior destroy the meaning of the scientific experiment. If we are not free to manage the arrangement of our apparatus, but rather all settings and outcomes were predetermined and predetermined and predetermined back to the Big Bang, that theory is called hyperdeterminism or superdeterminism. Well, if that's the case, how could an experiment decide, discriminate, validate, corroborate, or falsify a theory? Page 4 of the handout gives some classic quotations from Einstein and Schrödinger on spooky actions at a distance and entanglement, respectively, and shows the schematic diagram of a non-locality experiment. The word choices in the diagram have quotation marks because the angle settings of the detectors are not done manually by the experimenters at A and B. There isn't time. But by very fast switches and random number generators, or at least the very best random number generators that the experimenters can deliberately, by free choice, for the sake of the truth, design. I conclude, if conscious free choice by scientists is an illusion, then the scientific experiment is an illusion, then the credibility of natural science, insofar as its results are corroborated by experiments, is an illusion. Thank you for your attention.